Could you happily live in America with any of those 10 as president?
I think not any of the 10, maybe not any, but I mean, I think that the very big difference I think we're seeing in the way that we're all discussing this race is the difference in the Democratic Party. I think particularly for voters of color, there is no conversation of interest to talk about uniting, to be blunt, with the party that has given up not just its moral standing, but its soul to the person who is president of the United States right now. The danger of Donald Trump is much more extant to my community. It's much more extant to both my immigrant relatives, to African Americans, to Latinos. It's not about whether or not we can regain our public standing on the world stage and be seen as America was, to people who look like me. It's about imminent danger. Donald Trump is dangerous to our families. He's dangerous to our lives. My son, our youngest son, goes to Syracuse University, where right now, the manifesto of the Texas shooters being sent around to immigrant students, to black students, to Asian American students. People are afraid to be in school right now. And just being black or brown feels dangerous. LGBT community feel their marriages are in danger now. And so the idea of uniting and coming together, that sounds fine for Pete Buttigieg to say, to middle-class white America that wants to come together with their uncle who's a Trumper. That is not going to work in communities of color. And I think one of the fundamental challenges that Pete Buttigieg has is that he's not communicating to my community right now. He's not communicating to my community at all on issues like policing. People want to know why he fired that police chief. Saying that he's got a great, long-term plan for Black America. That's lovely. He speaks very well. Yeah. He's quite articulate. That is not helping people who are afraid and who want to know, can this guy connect to me? Can he connect to black people? Can he speak to African-American fears of the police? He's having a hard time doing that. And if he can't do that, he's not going to get the chance to change America on the world stage by being president of the United States. Because, sorry, even if he wins Iowa, voters in South Carolina right now are sticking with Biden. I don't see that changing, even if he were to win Iowa, because he's not proving something to South Carolina voters the way that Barack Obama had to do. He's a white candidate who's quite popular with white voters. That says nothing to South Carolina voters who want to know, what are you going to do about policing and voting rights and things that we care about and immigrant issues and get those kids unlocked out of those cages? So he's got to make a transition into the rest of the Democratic Party. I think for Sanders, he's got a lot of the same issue, right? When he talks about class, it's really resonant to a lot of younger, progressive black people. But in general, he hasn't broadened his base. I think Warren had a very good night. As usual, she was good, as she always is. She needs to also broaden her base. I think she's smart to broaden her discussion of health care to say maybe there's a transition. Maybe there's a way that we can let y'all try Medicare for all. Let you try the public option and see how it works out for you before we force everyone onto it. Maybe that's a smart thing to do. But I still think out of everyone who was on that stage tonight, I think that Booker, and at least in that, to me, Booker and Harris feel like they changed something about how people see them. And I think that was important for the two of them to do. I don't think anybody had a terrible night except maybe Tulsi Gabbard. But I don't know. I still walk away with it thinking that just who felt like they resonated was Kamala Harris.
Michael. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.